start the harder bit.
Oh yeah, sure. Hey everyone, welcome. I hope you're surviving, week 6 of the quarter? I definitely am not coping well with this week. There seems to be a lot going on and I'm sick of Zoom. And so I do appreciate that all of you are here today and giving us your attention and your time. So thank you so much. Let me quickly, in one sentence, introduce Hard Earth, and then I'll hand it off to Brian, who will introduce our speaker for today. So for those who aren't registered in this series as a one-unit course, Hard Earth, like a lot of the people on this call already know, is a seminar series, a speaker series where we have graduate students present work on a variety of topics that get at tough environmental dilemmas. The point of Hard Earth is to encourage research interaction between graduate and undergraduate students on campus, and we are associated with the Robley Robley Living Lab for Sustainable something, but Robley Hall, which is a fantastic sponsor of our series and also provides the physical space which we're not able to enjoy this quarter. So I'll now hand it off to Brian and welcome everyone again.
Great. So we're excited today to have Mary Catherine. Mary Catherine is a PhD student in Earth System Science. She looks at social and environmental determinants of health, focusing on people experiencing homelessness in her hometown, which is Nashville, which I think is what we're looking at in this first picture as well.
Yeah.
Sweet. So she looks in particular at formation of social support networks and how access to these types of social support is associated with different health outcomes. And as her fun fact, she grew up playing the fiddle in her dad's bluegrass band. So we'll turn it over to Mary Catherine for 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions, bluegrass related or otherwise. Thanks.
Exactly. Just in case you didn't believe I was from Nashville, now it's official. I'm in San Francisco now though, but so, okay. So, thanks everyone for coming. I know Ranjitha was talking about Zoom fatigue earlier, and I feel that myself. So I appreciate you guys coming to listen to me talk about my research, and I'm really excited to share it with you guys. So my name is Mary Catherine Anderson, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Earth System Sciences at Stanford. And like Brian was saying, broadly, I study social and environmental determinants of health among people who are experiencing homelessness. And I've spent the past 3 years conducting fieldwork among homeless populations in Nashville, Tennessee. So that's where all my data come from, are from homeless populations in Nashville. And we'll get to all that in a second. But before I begin, I want to really encourage you guys to think about how our health as human beings is linked to our social and biophysical environments, because that's going to be a key foundational concept underlying most everything I'm saying today. And I also want to add, please feel free to stop me if you have questions or if something doesn't make sense or you're just generally wondering about anything. I rarely get to talk about my work in sort of a more casual conversational format, so I would love questions. So if you have them, please ask. Okay, so I'm going to start out by showing you guys this figure here. And this, can y'all see, like, is the gallery view blocking part of the figure, or is it okay? You're good. Okay. So I'm going to start by showing you guys this figure. So this is a figure I put together that outlines the processes that I focus on broadly in my research. And the figure shows that health can be affected by environment through both direct and indirect pathways. So environment can impact health directly through fairly obvious pathways, right? Like chronic exposure, extreme temperatures, air quality, green space, those types of things that we traditionally think of as environmental determinants of health. But additionally, environment can impact health indirectly through the mediating influence of these social structures. Not sure if you can see my cursor, but so this is where like a bit of theory comes in, but not too much. So within anthropology, there's this theory called behavioral ecology theory. And the long and short of it is that we can view human social networks and human social structures as adaptations to specific local environments. So if environment varies, you'd expect social structures to vary accordingly. So within the context of homelessness, we can think about social structures or social networks as adaptations to the homeless environment. And indeed they are, because these social networks can provide critical survival resources necessary for just surviving homelessness. So these networks can provide resource access, social support. They can influence health norms. They can influence behaviors surrounding shared substance use, violence, safety and protection. And perhaps most relevantly right now, they can affect the spread of infectious disease, right? Because we know that's contingent on human contact. So all that being said, my dissertation research centers around two main questions. And those are, one, how are social factors, for example, social support networks, associated with health among people experiencing homelessness? And the second is, how is the homeless environment with health, or associated with health among people experiencing homelessness? And that environment is defined broadly. So we have like social and environmental dimensions, but we'll get to that in a second. But those are the two research questions guiding my dissertation work. And today I'm going to focus mostly on the second one, which is, how is the homeless environment associated with health among people experiencing homelessness? And you'll see this PEH a lot. That's just an abbreviation for people experiencing homelessness, just because those are long words to write repetitively. So PEH equals people experiencing homelessness. So like I said, I do all my field work in Nashville, Tennessee, which is where I'm from. And Nashville actually presented a really good research opportunity for me, because within the homelessness literature, like at least the academic literature, there's virtually no work that's been done on homeless populations in Nashville. And that's problematic because homelessness is a growing problem in Nashville. So Nashville, like every other major US city, is in the midst of an affordable housing crisis, and homelessness is resultantly increasing as a direct result of that. So Nashville is one of the major cities in the South where we have a significantly growing homeless population. Additionally, the number of homeless deaths have increased steadily since 2015. Although we don't have great data on 2019, but at least from 2015 to 2018, homeless deaths have risen in Nashville. And in 2018, 127 people experiencing homelessness died in Nashville. And the official count is like slightly less than 2,000. So that's a pretty high mortality rate just from being homeless. The actual count's much higher than that, because the way that the government dictates you count it overlooks probably thousands of people who are like technically homeless. Maybe they're couch surfing or staying in a hotel or something, but still, this is a sizable amount of the homeless population that's dying prematurely every year. And in many cases, these are literally instances of people dying on the streets. Homelessness is dangerous. It kills people. Make no mistake about it. This comes as no surprise, and yet fatalities are like still continuing to rise. So this is a serious problem that we need to address. Just to contextualize that a little bit, in my work alone, I think I lost 5 study participants over the course of 18 months, some of which were in incredibly traumatic ways. One of my friends burned to death in his sleeping bag. I had another friend that passed away the week of his 62nd birthday, who had just gotten into housing. So he got into housing and passed away immediately after surviving like decades, literal decades on the street. And then another friend of mine was hit as she was pushing a cart across the street by a drunk driver. So homelessness is dangerous and it kills people. So circling in a different direction here, but rather than making the focus of today's talk the actual like results of my research and how this contributes to theory and academic literature surrounding homelessness, I really want to take this time to share a part of my work that I rarely ever get to discuss, which is my methods, specifically my field work. And that's really the heart and soul of what I do. I mean, I spent 3 years in the field consistently spending time with people who are homeless every day. And that was, in my case, what was required to get the data I needed. So I want the focus of this to be sort of like, how do we go about addressing hard research questions at the population level? So in my case, it would be at the level or at the population level of people experiencing homelessness. And I think one thing people don't really talk about in terms of their academic research is there's really like no right way to do it. Everything is totally contingent on what you're interested in. So what do you want to know? And no one can answer that question but you. So that's important before designing any research project, is you have to identify that question. And that can be a really challenging process to kind of hone in on those research questions you're interested in. So, and a journey. So as a fun fact, when I got to Stanford, I was actually supposed to work on an STD project in Southern Africa, where we were going to look at STD spread among a group of semi-nomadic pastoralists in Namibia. And the pathways we were interested in are like similar to the ones that I do in this work, where we're looking at ways environment affects the formation of sexual networks, which affects the formation or affects the dynamics of disease spread. But unfortunately, that grant didn't quite come through, and that was like year one at Stanford. So I was pretty much left to my own devices to figure out what I wanted to focus my PhD on. And I had not even a vague idea of what I wanted to do, but I was driving through San Francisco one day and really paying attention to all the homeless camps I was seeing, and just how close these people were to like an urban environment or built environment. And I mean, especially if you live in San Francisco, these are folks we see every single day. Like, you cannot help but notice that homelessness affects health. So it was in that moment where I realized you didn't necessarily have to go to these like far and away locations to study ways in which environment affects health. This is a problem not only in the developing world, but the developed world. We know that poor, vulnerable populations are disproportionately negatively affected by environmental factors like air quality, air pollution, lack of green space, all these issues. So that's kind of how I centered on this homelessness thing. And I wanted to do the work in my home community because, as I said, there wasn't a lot of research that exists on homelessness in Nashville. So in doing that, I had to ask myself this question, which is how do you build a research project from scratch? And I think this is important to spend a bit of time talking about, because in any sort of academic pursuit, we're like so obsessed with results, like not necessarily even in grad school, but like in undergrad, we want our degree. Like we're so concerned with checking the boxes and getting on to the next thing. What we don't really talk about is how much trial and error and just downright like getting boots on the ground is actually required when you're building a research project from scratch. Because the fact of the matter is, especially when you're working with human populations that you are not yourself a member of, you can think you have an idea about how some process works, but until you actually spend time talking with folks, observing folks, and just really ingratiating yourselves in the community that you're interested in, you're not going to be able to do good work. So the answer to this question, how do you build a research project from scratch, is by doing it. And that's basically what I did. So I just reached out to contacts I had in Nashville who might know people who worked in the homeless sector. I didn't have any immediate connection to the homeless community there, so I just started networking. And this required a lot of trial and error. So initially, I was going to be working with this clinic in Nashville that exclusively served people who were experiencing homelessness. And we worked for, probably months developing, I wrote it all, but like this was a months-long partnership where I developed a 60-page proposal. Like I was supposed to submit to their risk management committee for approval, and like that's how I was gonna do my dissertation data. They had agreed to partner with like a Stanford researcher, good to go. And then like a few weeks before I submitted it, they had turnover and they hired a new CEO who's like incredibly risk averse. So all that work, like 60-page proposal, I got a 1-sentence email back and they're like, we'll pass. I had no idea what I was gonna do because I had spent months working on this, and I was like, I'm done, I'm leaving Stanford, like I can't do it. I have had setback after setback, like with the Namibia thing and with this, I didn't know what to do. But there's good people around, and with the support of the most amazing postdoc in the world in my lab, Ashley Hazel, who actually went solo, like by herself, to Namibia to collect all of her dissertation data, lived there for a year, in the wilderness, like out there. She suggested I just recruit homeless people off the streets and from service sites, which is what we would call a convenient sampling method. So you're sort of randomly selecting members of a population in hopes you'll get a representative demographic. But given that I wasn't going to be doing this sampling as a service provider or a part of any research team or a part of a research team that had like enrolled a set cohort of people, I was essentially committing to cold calling homeless people to ask if they would be up for having a conversation with me about their lives and their health. And that's how I collected my data. This is what it looked like. So over the course of 18 months, I interviewed around 500 people experiencing homelessness in Nashville. And I did this, like I said, using a convenient sampling method where I recruited participants from mostly from the streets. So just kind of walking up to folks who appeared to be homeless. And I kind of had a bit of a beat, like there are certain congregate spots where like people who are homeless are known to hang out. So I would go to like certain places on, Tuesdays, Thursdays, whatever. And in addition to that, there were several brick and mortar service facilities that had agreed to partner with me in this work. So I also collected data from their, recruited participants and collected data from their sites. And this is a research approach called community-based research. And the key to community-based research is getting involved with the community you're interested in, like I was saying earlier. Here's a list of the main organizations I worked with in Nashville and a few shots from what I consider my like pre-fieldwork phase. So here I want to add that before I collected a single piece of data, like any kind of information that would be used in any sort of qualitative or quantitative analysis, I spent about a year in the field, like in Nashville on and off, just spending time with members of the homeless population and people that serve them. So I volunteered, I visited camps, I actually stayed in camps. We did some sit-ins for some camps and like cop watches for camps that were whose residents were facing eviction by the city. I shadowed people who were homeless, and that was a lot of work, but it's incredibly important work to do anytime you're working with any kind of population, because you really have to familiarize yourself with what's important and relevant to the people who belong to the populations that you're interested in. And one example would be like even the wording of questions. I remember I had like a candidate question which involved asking people their sources of income in the last 30 days. And one of them was, have you panhandled in the last 30 days? And we can think of, I don't know if anyone's familiar with what that means, but basically like if you see someone standing on the side of the road asking for money, you call that panhandling. And like here in San Francisco, you'll see signs all the time on street corners that say no panhandling. So that seemed like a reasonable question to ask as a source of income. And I remember asking about panhandling and people sort of like laughed and they're like, yeah, we don't call it that. It's called flying a sign. So you'd say like, oh, I have to like get out there, wake up early and get out on the street because I'm going to fly today. Or like, I'm flying a sign today, so I'll have enough money to buy XYZ. So I didn't know that. So I immediately changed the wording of my survey after that. But that's just one example of like why spending time with these communities that you're interested in is so important, just so you can like get the wording right. And that's also really important for trust building, because with vulnerable populations, with any vulnerable population, but particularly homeless populations, I wouldn't say it's the easiest being an outsider in those groups. So kind of establishing like a rapport and making friends and like regularly spending time with people, that's really important, because then once you get to the point where you're collecting data, you actually have people who are willing to vouch for you and tell you that like, or tell other people like, oh, she's cool, she's not going to exploit you, basically, because this is a population that again is really frequently they're vulnerable, but often people exploit them as well. Okay, so based on that year of exploratory ethnographic work, I developed this beast of a survey. It's 27 pages and it took about an hour to administer. So I would interview folks who were study participants and I would record their answers. Okay, so getting back to these research questions, particularly the second one, which is how is the homeless environment associated with health among people experiencing homelessness? I want to share with you guys, not necessarily super, fancy models or anything like that, but just some descriptive results that illustrate how exposed or how susceptible people experiencing homelessness are to like their external biophysical environments. But before we get into that, I want to flash a quick slide about the demographics of my study's population. So the takeaway here is that these demographics are fairly consistent with nationwide homelessness data, and most people experiencing homelessness are, they tend to be middle-aged, single, white men. And just a general note, like anytime you're convenience sampling, you want to make sure that your study demographics like roughly echo what would be expected, or roughly match up to the demographics that would be expected if you like scaled up your population. So if you had gotten to a certain point in your data collection period and you checked demographics and you had entirely, I don't know, African-American females, you might kind of be a bit concerned because that would be a biased sample. So you just have to be mindful of this anytime you're doing convenience sampling. Okay, so environmental stuff, back to that. So this plot shows the number of waking hours per day on the x-axis here that people are spending inside in a typical day. And on the y-axis here, we just have the frequency. So this is over a 12-month data collection period, this particular data set was. And as you can see, a majority of people who are homeless spend less than 5 hours a day indoors. And that's across all seasons. So we have extreme heat and extreme cold. So we can break this down by seasonal extreme, and Nashville gets quite hot in the summer and quite cold in the winter. So this is a subset of the population that I interviewed in the summer, and it seems like most people, well, everyone interviewed in the summer spent less than 10 hours a day inside. And in the winter, we see a similar distribution. It's a bit wider distribution, but still, in general, these people are spending much time outside despite many nights and days of below freezing temperatures in Nashville. Although that said, this past winter was pretty mild, but when I was doing this, it was very cold that winter. And then just to really drive that home, a majority of people I interviewed reported sleeping 7 out of the past 7 nights outside. So my study's population is mostly unsheltered people who are homeless. So these are people that typically don't use shelters, and I would say anecdotally that that's a majority of people in Nashville, because Nashville is one of the only major US cities that does not have a city-run year-round shelter. The only year-round option is the rescue mission, and that's what we would call a high barrier shelter. For instance, there's a men's campus and a women's campus, so like couples have to separate, you can't bring pets. It's not regarded as being very inclusive in terms of like LGBTQ communities and communities like that. So there's tons of barriers to service access that I won't go into, but those are only a few reasons why people forego shelters even in extreme temperatures. So that just increases your environmental risk factors even more. And I want to emphasize that investigating the role of environment and health among people who are experiencing homelessness is going to be a really important topic in the earth sciences going forward. So this is actually a paper from 2009 that proposes a framework for looking at the role of climate change and health outcomes among people experiencing homelessness. So we know that with climate change, right, we're expected to have increased frequencies of heat waves, storms, floods, air pollution, and all that's going to have significant health impacts among the world's most vulnerable populations, like the homeless. So this is going to be a really important issue going forward, and I'd like to add that if this is something you're interested in, there's not a lot of empirical work that's been done on this, like at all. So there's definitely room in this field to do some cool stuff just because it's really underexplored. So given that the topic of this speaker series is shocks to the system, I think we can agree that, or at least I contend that I don't think we've experienced any greater health shock in our lifetimes than coronavirus. And unfortunately, we're seeing people experiencing homelessness being disproportionately negatively affected by the pandemic, because these are people that don't have the option to stay at home or shelter in place. So what do you do? And this is an article from the New Yorker, which the title sums up the problem pretty well, which is, how do you shelter in place when you don't have a home? And this is a question that policymakers still haven't been able to answer. This is causing a lot of problems as we speak today. And on the right here is the suggested reading article I sent you guys, which highlights some of the difficulties of getting people off the streets. So California was actually ahead of the curve in procuring like temporary housing options for people who are homeless, like hotel rooms and mobile homes and things like that. But I think the Bay Area, I think in this article it says there were only like 1,000 rooms available. So you're not even getting it. I mean, you're barely hitting a minority there. There's just so many people that just don't have options or places in which to shelter. So I've become rather obsessed with this in the past few months, and it's actually changed the direction of my own research. I was not intending on studying COVID as part of my dissertation, but I can't help it. I mean, this is something that definitely needs looking into, and fortunately, the data do exist to begin doing that. So I kind of want to shift gears and talk about how we can try and answer tough questions about vulnerable populations in a time of COVID. So how can we care about or care for the health of people who are homeless in the time of COVID? But I think an even more important question is, how do we get people to care? Because we have neglected our homeless population for decades. I mean, this is like not new in America, right? This is a population that is always pushed to the fringes of society, negatively stereotyped, blamed frequently for all kinds of things. It's never been at the forefront of Americans' minds, I don't think, but COVID has shown us that we cannot ignore it, and I will tell you why. So I want to direct your attention back to this slide I showed earlier in the presentation, and think about how these pathways might be affected by any shock to the system. But let's think about this in terms of coronavirus. So COVID-19 affects each and every one of those pathways for the homeless. So when you're homeless during COVID, your environment is changing because people are being forced to relocate and isolate as best they can, which can sometimes mean moving into unsafe environments. I mean, safety on the streets is very hard to come by. So when you're moving into uncharted territory, that can introduce a whole new set of dangers. Additionally, we know that social structures are a crucial part of disease transmission. And with social distancing protocols, we'd expect people's social structures to change, but it's unclear how this is happening among people who are homeless because there's such variability in homeless responses across the nation. So in some cases, in some cities, they're opening these large congregate temporary shelters to house people during the pandemic, which is obviously problematic because that inherently involves being around a crowd of people, which violates social distancing protocols. In other cases, like for very sick and elderly people, they have the option to move into temporary private lodging, like hotel rooms, mobile homes, things like that. And in some cases, like I know in Nashville, they're actually encouraging people to stay out of shelters for that very reason, just because it's so dangerous. Like you can see, outbreaks spring up and things like that. So for the first time ever, there are outreach organizations that are like handing out tents to people saying like, no, like camp outside. We don't, try and avoid shelters. And the reason I say for the first time ever is most cities are concerned with like sort of NIMBY style approaches to homelessness, right? Like they don't want to see it. Like we don't want to see tent cities. We don't want to see visible homelessness. So it's interesting that this pandemic is encouraged something that we've been criminalizing for many, many years. So the takeaway from that is the lack of a national unified homeless response has the potential to prove devastating for these homeless communities. And it is. We're seeing massive outbreaks at homeless shelters across the country. And we have a huge problem on our hands. An even larger problem, and this is sort of in the vein of getting other people to care who are not homeless about homeless people who are homeless during COVID. An even larger problem is if we neglect the health of people who are homeless, this has the potential to sustain the epidemic in the general population. So this is sort of a new research question I've been developing, and we've put together some toy models to sort of demonstrate this phenomenon. And I want to issue the caveat that these are hypothetical populations. So these are, you're going to see some social networks. These are not based on like empirical data. They're just sort of proof of concept. So we make sets of glorious assumptions. So take these with a grain of salt, but they do demonstrate a known epidemiological phenomenon that we would expect to see among homeless populations. So, okay. So here we have two hypothetical social networks. On the left, we have a social network of size 50 that's fairly densely connected, as you can see. So the average number, the average member of this social network has, on average, around 5 social contacts, 4.88. And we can think of like, so this might be an example of like a homeless encampment, like a really big encampment and ties between members of that homeless camp. Or it could be maybe a small shelter, like all these people are staying together. And maybe some people are in closer contact than others. So situations like that. And on the right, we have a much larger network, size 400, which is a hypothetical housed population. And as you can see, this network is a lot more sparsely connected. It's not nearly as dense as the people experiencing homelessness network. And this is clearly composed of individuals who are able to practice social distancing. So the average number of social contacts for every member of this network is a little under 2, 1.75. And quick note, just in all these network figures, the dots or nodes are individuals, and the connections between or the lines between dots represent like a social contact or a social connection, for those of you not familiar with like social network visualizations. Okay, so we know that like homeless populations and housed populations don't exist in isolation from one another in the real world, right? There's some level of interfacing between these two groups in general society. So this is a combined, so this is basically just these two networks combined. And so here we have this densely connected subgroup of people experiencing homelessness, right? That on average have a higher number of social contacts. And so these folks are in blue, and this is the housed population. So again, more sparsely connected, have a lower number of social contacts on average. This is a group of people able to practice social distancing. But what I want to draw your attention to are these nodes, like these blue nodes that are connected to purple nodes and vice versa. So in social network analysis, we call these types of connections, or we call these individuals bridges, which essentially means that like if you're a bridge, you're an individual that spans multiple communities. So you have social ties in both, and you serve to like bridge these communities together from a network perspective. And this is an inevitable fact so long as people are forced to shelter in public spaces, right? So we can think of maybe people who are homeless who are still sleeping outside in public spaces. Those are folks who are occupying the same spaces that the general population has to go into to like conduct their daily essential tasks. So there's the potential for disease relevant contact there. Additionally, we can think about people on the front lines, like in coronavirus, serving folks who are homeless, like outreach workers, caseworkers, people that work at shelters, doctors providing healthcare to people who are homeless. Those could be bridges. Additionally, like the homeless don't exist as a community that never interact with housed people, right? So like if you're homeless, it's possible that you have housed friends or family members that whose houses you might go to take a shower, have a meal, or sleep for a night. So there is some level of mixing between housed and unhoused populations. And as it turns out, this has meaningful effects on epidemic dynamics. So this is like a COVID-esque epidemic. We parameterize these models using COVID-like parameters. So again, this is not exactly a COVID model, but we can definitely use it for purposes of comparison. So what we did was we used an SIR model, which is just a compartmental disease model. So the SIR stands for susceptible, infected, and recovered. And how these models work is you have like a closed population. I mean, you can make them more complicated. It doesn't have to be closed, but for simplicity's sake, say you have a closed population. Each member of that population is going to fall into either the susceptible category, the infected category, or the recovered category. And what you're modeling is movement between those compartments. So really the important the result of interest here, I guess, is this red curve, which is the number of infected. So we can think of that as prevalence. So this is for, on the left, this is the epidemic dynamics for a population of people experiencing this network on the left, basically. So how a COVID-like epidemic would affect that population. I think this was done over the course of 6 months, but I guess it must have like equalized at 100 days. But the point being, note the peak of the curve. That's what's important. So at the peak of this epidemic and this population of people experiencing homelessness, you can see that over half of the people in this population are infected. Remember, this was a population of size 50. So even having like 5 contacts isn't that many, right? But when you have like a small population with a relatively high number of contacts, you're going to see a much higher prevalence. In contrast, in this housed population, so this network here on the right, this is what the epidemic curve looks like for that. And this is no surprise. We know that social distancing works. So reducing number of social contacts means reducing prevalence. So you can see this curve is much smaller, much lower. And I think this was a population, yeah, it was 400 people. So very small percentage end up with this COVID-like disease at the peak of this epidemic. And then remember, we mix these networks together, which is like more indicative of a real life scenario because there's some level of mixing between housed and unhoused populations. And this is the result. So as you can see, the peak in this plot is much higher than the peak in this plot of the hypothetical housed population. Still lower than in just the unhoused population, but the point that all these are trying to make is that even if you have a majority of your population sheltering in place, doing all the right things, social distancing, even if that's a majority of people are doing that, and you still have a small sub-component of that population who's not able to social distance, so a small component that's, say, still densely connected, you still have the potential to sustain an epidemic in a general population. And this is like a widely observed phenomenon, like heterogeneity and contact drives epidemics. So when you have things like clustering, like densely connected groups of people, within those clusters, there's all kinds of things that can happen. You can have like lower epidemic thresholds where epidemics break out where you wouldn't necessarily expect them to, given the dynamics of the disease. So yeah, contact matters, contact rate matters. And the coronavirus pandemic, I think, has shown us how interconnected all of our health really is. And we cannot contain the coronavirus pandemic if we ignore homeless populations. We just can't. So I want to end with the comment that housing is undoubtedly the best healthcare we can offer people experiencing homelessness. And I think if there's any silver lining to coronavirus, I hope it's shown us this. And I hope that in a post-COVID world, policymakers really realize the urgency of creating affordable housing for people because it is a public health crisis. So that's all I have. And I would love to hear questions from you guys if you have any.
Hi there.
Thanks, Mary Catherine. That was awesome and fantastic. And
oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm trying to figure out, I don't think I can, let's see, if I stop sharing my screen, will I be able to see the chat if people put questions in there?
I guess so, yeah. Folks who are on the call, if you have questions but are not in a silent environment, feel free to add them to the chat.
There we
If
go.
not, feel free to just speak up and ask a question.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. I can see it now. And you can see me? Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Hi, I'm Christina.
Hi.
I always ask, how, I know you talked about how you were led to the homelessness research, but could you talk a little bit about your journey prior to Stanford, and how you kind of got interested in this?
Yeah, absolutely. So so in undergrad, I actually majored in cellular and molecular biology. So nothing immediately relevant to homeless populations. And I was actually pre-med. I went to Auburn and I was going to go to med school and do the whole nine. And then the more and more I shadowed like doctors, I just got less and less interested in it. There was something about treating individuals that was far less exciting to me than studying the health of entire populations. So I just got interested in research at larger scales, and talk about like a difference in scale. I mean, going from like, cells, single cells to like entire populations. So after I finished my undergrad at Auburn, I did my master's at Cambridge in the UK, and I studied applied biological anthropology. And so that was how I really got into social determinants of health and social networks. My advisor, I had never heard of social networks before I started my master's, and I had an advisor there who studied social networks around primates, and he modeled Ebola outbreaks, and I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And I just thought it was such a useful tool to explain so many phenomena in the world. Like, it's a really neat method. You can kind of apply it to anything. And so I knew I wanted to do something with social networks and vulnerable populations. And then the rest just kind of, like I said, trial and error. You just kind of have to chip away at potential questions to find the one that you're interested in doing a PhD on, because that's quite a commitment. You really want to like your topic of study, or else you won't want to like fling yourself off a tall bridge or something. It's a long haul. But yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
We have a question in the chat. If you want to take a look, Mary Catherine.
Yeah. Okay. So Rebecca's asking, I'm curious what the average number of contacts is for house versus PEH under not a coronavirus situation, and how other diseases like the flu and others have similarity. Okay. So yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I didn't do a comparison group, so like I can't speak to relative differences in the average number of social contacts between housed and unhoused people. I can tell you that not having a house definitely ups your chances of encountering other individuals when you're sleeping in public spaces. So there's probably more casual contacts around people experiencing homelessness, or among people experiencing homelessness. But I think in terms of maybe like meaningful contacts, like friendships or support, they're probably not that different. And then, so in the case of like a flu and other stuff, yeah, I mean, there are certainly instances of outbreaks stemming from populations of people who are homeless. Like in San Diego in 2017, there was a huge hepatitis A outbreak. And I think there were like literally hundreds of new cases, and they traced it to the streets there, like the homeless population. And the conditions were just, they were awful. Like the streets were not clean, like people, like there were used drug needles all over the place. And they directed public health interventions like toward the homeless community, and they installed like public hand washing stations. They did like mass vaccinations of homeless people, and that worked. And that was an instance of like everyone who had a new case of hepatitis A, like everyone wasn't homeless. These were people that were also housed who were just interfacing with members of the homeless community. And in terms of the flu, I don't know that that's really been studied among homeless populations specifically. I'd have to look into that. But, I don't think contact would really change. Like we've never seen people's contact levels change like we have during COVID, right? Because we've never had like mass social distancing before. So yeah, I don't know if we can really make comparisons. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but I tried. Okay, and Amari is asking, what are barriers that make housing for the homeless difficult? Oh my gosh, so many. So I would say some of the biggest so to really understand homelessness, like you cannot overlook the justice system. There's just like such a tight link between the two. And, you know, these are folks, most of these folks, even before they were homeless, lived at or below the poverty level. And when that's your reality, often you have to do illegal things to survive. And often you get caught and you end up in the justice system. And once you have a felony on your record, it's really, really hard to get into like public housing. So, you know, you can get like Section 8 vouchers and things like that from the government that make you eligible for government assistance or government housing. But if you have a felony on your record, that makes it a lot harder. In addition, that makes it really hard to get a job. So you're not going to be able to make enough money to pay rent for like a non-subsidized option. Additionally, I think what people don't realize about homelessness is you're just facing like one roadblock after another. And I think people resign themselves sometimes. Like I've encountered people in my work, for instance, that are like, I choose to be out here, it's a choice. I don't know that that's necessarily like a conscious choice. I think like the world has told them so many times that like they don't fit into society, that they have found their happiness or their purpose elsewhere, I guess. I don't know. I mean, it is really heartbreaking when you see people give up. So the barriers are numerous. Okay, what are the challenges in sharing this research to policymakers? So many. So part of my work is, like I said, it's community-based research. So after I'm done with this, like all my de-identified data is going to like national stakeholders. I mean, I don't really need it. You know, I mean, that hopefully it'll provide some service to them so they can go beyond the anecdotal. When you're a service provider or a social worker, like you don't have time to sit down and quantitatively measure these things. So hopefully this will provide data that can be used in like data-driven approaches to services and hopefully affordable housing. Did you ever, on Vesh, did you ever experience any resistance while collecting data from people experiencing homelessness? Yes, that was quite a challenge early on. I mean, you do develop a thick skin, I have to say. Like, I think earlier, like, I remember the first day I went out and collected data, I saw like people I had known for like over a year at this park downtown. And I was like, oh, they'll talk to me. But they had only, I guess, seen me in the context of like faith-based outreach groups. So I guess they just assumed I was like a nun. I don't know. My name's Mary Catherine. But so it was funny because when we got to the park, like no one would talk to me. And I realized it was because they were like all wanting to smoke pot and like didn't want me to see it. And like, I don't care, you know, like I'm not, it has no bearing on me. So like things like that, like I feel like people are slow to trust because folks have been, you know, taken advantage of and judged like pretty much the whole time they've been homeless. And sometimes people feel like they have to put on like, they have to be like better than the average citizen, like not engage in any kind of vices or anything like that, which is ridiculous. I mean, like we drink cocktails, like it's California, like pot is legal. Like why is it that these things are okay in housed populations, but we judge when we see in unhoused populations? So I think just leveling with people and just telling them that like you're just there to chat with them, and that's really all you can do, and just be genuine. And yes, of course, you're going to get people that do not want to talk to you and say horrible things about you or yell at you. And a lot of folks are unfortunately like mentally ill, and you just can't take that personally. Also, I didn't mention this, but I had a few small grants where I was able to provide participant incentives. And that's kind of a fine line because you don't want it to be coercive. Like you don't want the incentive to be so high that people feel like they have to participate. So I did, I think for the hour-long interview, I did $15 gift cards so people could pick whether they wanted Walmart and like fast food or whatever. So we didn't use cash. The incentives definitely helped. But even then, yeah, you get yelled at. It's just part of it, you know? Can't take it personally. So, okay, I think that's it.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Mary Catherine.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it.
Feel free to stick around if you have questions you want to ask in a smaller setting.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.